leading into the Great Depression. The Great Depression lasted a good 10 years, and in the late 1939, or not late 1930s, the Great Depression was considered to have ended, and immediately after World War II started. World War II in the middle of the 1940s ended, and that led into the Bretton Woods Agreement, which is where the U.S. dollar was made the world reserve currency, and in the 1970s, Nixon took us off the gold standard. And we're going to talk about all this in depth. So talk about World War II. It started on September 1st, 1939, and ended September 2nd, 1945. It was a very, very gruesome and devastating war, and no one was left unscathed. However, the U.S. was the last major world economy to survive the war. Great Britain, the previous major world power, was left torn apart and in a lot of debt, which actually led to them giving independence to several of their colonies, including India. So after the aftermath of World War II led to the Bretton Woods Conference, which led to the Bretton Woods Agreement. So the Bretton Woods Conference was where 44 leaders from the Allied nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, hence the name Bretton Woods Conference. And it was basically just to discuss who the new world power would be, who the new major world power would be. And the U.S. emerged as the new economic leader, as I said before, because Great Britain, the previous economic leader, was left in tatters. And this led to the U.S. dollar being used in all major forms of international trade, particularly oil. And we'll talk about oil a little later and how that whole system was created. But this primarily, and most importantly, created an international gold-backed standard. And by gold-backed standard, when we say the gold standard, we mean that our currency is backed by a tangible asset, that asset being gold. So with paper currencies, it's beneficial usually to have them, to a certain extent, to have them backed by a tangible asset, being gems or pearls or something that people consider valuable. And for us, it was gold. So in your grandparents' time, great-grandparents' time, they could walk into the bank and give the teller a certain amount of money and get gold back, which now, if you try to do that, they'll laugh at you. So, as I said, around 1940s, mid-1930s, the Bretton Woods Conference happened, and the gold standard was kind of created. A good 20 years later, in the 1970s, President Richard Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger were kind of predicting where the U.S. dollar, the future of the U.S. dollar, and what it would look like. They knew that the value of gold was volatile, and since the U.S. dollar, as I said before, was tied to gold. If gold is volatile, then the U.S. dollar itself is volatile. And if they wanted our economy and the value of our dollar to grow, they knew they had to ditch the gold standard. End quote. They knew that the destruction of the international gold standard under the Bretton Woods arrangement would cause a decline in the artificial global demand of the U.S. dollar. So on August 15th, 1971, Nixon took us off the gold standard, which is where we are today. So our dollars aren't actually backed by anything. They're backed by the good faith and trust of the Federal Reserve, which, another note, the Federal Reserve, who owns all of our money, isn't actually a part of the U.S. government. The Federal Reserve is a private bank. So how we print money, Obama himself can't just say, hey, I want to print a couple $100,000 a day. Obama has to call the Federal Reserve and take out a loan with the Federal Reserve for the money to be printed. So we don't actually own our own money.
All right, the petrodollar. It was basically the name given to the U.S. dollar as a result of an agreement between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. And once backed by gold, now backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, basically the dollar has to use other things to create its value. And our currency is backed basically by the U.S. economy. The Saudi Arabia deal, the U.S., represented by Henry Kissinger, met with the Saudi Arabian oil family. And basically, the U.S. agreed to protect Saudi Arabian oil shipments out of the Gulf in exchange for Saudi Arabia using the U.S. dollar in their deals with other nations, purchasing their oil. And by 1975, all oil-producing nations of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, agreed to price oil in dollars and hold surplus oil proceeds in U.S. government debt securities, also in exchange for offers by the U.S. And basically, the U.S. offered a bunch of incentives, mostly cash and security-based incentives for Saudi Arabia and a large portion of the oil-producing nations, which led to the greatest economic system, and what it can now be considered one of the most brilliant geopolitical and economic strategies in recent political memory, because because oil is so valuable in today's world, and most of the economies of every country in the world runs off of oil, basically, everyone using the US dollar to trade for it drove the value of the US dollar up and increased global demand for US debt securities, and allowed the US to purchase oil with a currency it can print at will, which basically means the US can control the value of its own currency in exchange for controlling basically the price of oil.
So the reason why it's kind of important is that, like, even if, say, China wants to purchase oil from Saudi Arabia, the U.S. isn't involved in that in any way, except for China has to do it in the U.S. dollar, which is why it's really important.
A brief history of BRICS to start out. BRIC was actually a term coined by Jim O'Neill, who was a former Goldman Sachs economist. BRIC is an acronym that brought together the nations Brazil, Russia, India, and China. O'Neill predicted these nations to grow in economic size to end up challenging other countries such as the U.S. On December 24th, 2010, South Africa was also included in the BRIC nations, making them BRICS nations. The first informal meeting was in 2006 during the UN General Assembly between the first 4 BRIC countries, and since then they have met a total of 6 times. The first summit being in 2009 in Russia. These summits helped develop a certain depth and scope of dialogue between the members, which enhanced understanding between the countries. The total annual output for the BRIC nations last year totaled $29.6 trillion, and we're just behind the U.S. and European Union, which were at $34.2 trillion. Russia and China are both using their new economic power to buy gas with their own currency instead of using the U.S. dollar. Currency swaps between China and Russia are underway for an initial $25 billion to allow direct transactions of this oil. Now, specifically about Russia, they have initialized a de-dollarization plan to move away from the American dollar. And they have also signed agreements with Gazprom, which is the largest natural gas exporter in Russia, to switch payments from dollars to euros. They have also, Russia also has plans to enhance trade and economic cooperation within BRICS in the coming years, as well as expanding social cooperation. On to China. The International Monetary Fund just added the Chinese yuan to their list of reserve currencies, and along with that, they have made deals with Russia and Gazprom to export 80,000 tons of oil, but Gazprom will only accept payment in Chinese yuan.
Okay, so there's predictions about the petrodollar failure because of several reasons, because China and Japan are dumping the U.S. dollar in bilateral trade because they have unveiled plans to promote direct exchange of their currencies in a bid to cut costs for companies and boost their bilateral trade. But first, both countries need to buy U.S. dollars before converting them into the desired currency that will add extra costs. Also, going with Russia and the China currency agreement, they are determined to break the power that the U.S. dollar has over the international trade, and China seems absolutely determined to change the way that international trade is done by becoming Africa's biggest trading partner, and the deal that they made with the United Arab Emirates to ditch the U.S. dollar and use their own currencies in oil transactions with each other. Tensions between Iran is making them aggressively walk away from the U.S. dollar in international trade. For example, it has been reported that India will begin to use gold to buy oil from Iran. We will adopt another more stable currency, most likely whatever the new standard is, which is from the International Monetary Fund and United Nations have been pushing for a new world reserve currency. U.S. consumers would suddenly find that all those cheap imported goods would rise in price dramatically, as would the price of gas. So needless to say, the U.S. government really needs the petrodollar system to continue. So if the reign of the US dollar as global reserve currency ends, the US government is going to have a much harder time financing its debt.
Okay, so the big point is the petrodollar is going to collapse one way or the other. And what Lena was trying to say was it's probably going to be really, really, really bad for the U.S. and we're, kind of screwed. But what I'm trying to come across is that America could be okay because it is the second largest exporter and so of goods. So in the case of the petrodollar collapsing, we could, in exchange, instead of doing something like a petrodollar, it can be something like the industrial dollar. So, everyone can exchange goods through the dollar. So the demand for the dollar will still be high. A different version of the dollar, but it's not going to be the petrodollar because we're not going to use the petrodollar.
Yeah, so basically what she's saying is the petrodollar is created around a system where people have to purchase oil in the American dollar. And we could create a new system since we're the second world's largest exporter of goods, where if people want to purchase any of the American goods, they do so in the American dollar. So, in conclusion, we basically just talked about the petrodollar, what the petrodollar is, and how the petrodollar came to be, and how the petrodollar is gradually failing, and how we predict it will fail by 2050. And then we just talked about either we will adopt a new currency and find some way to save the American dollar, or we'll adopt another country's currency, or find some way to survive. But we don't exactly think that the U.S.